Officially recording. So for all you folks who are just tuning in, Sustainable Design Masterclass, we're joined by Thomas Fernley Pearson. This is Restoring Ecology in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now you're good to go. Thanks for shouting that out to me.
Thank you very much, Rowley. I'd like to start by thanking you all for joining us tonight and for taking an interest in my experiences. I hope that I can provoke some discussion and really help you to develop your own ideas about restoration ecology and using biological regeneration in dry lands. So I'd like to start by introducing the East Mediterranean for those who aren't familiar with the region. It's typically called the Levant, presumably because it's where the sun rises from a European or a sort of a Mediterranean-centric perspective. Can everyone see the slides as I progress? I hope that's a yes.
Yeah, give me some ones if you can see the slides. Gabrielle says yes, yes,
Perfect.
yes, yes.
Okay, I just hoped I wasn't the only one who could see them.
No, you can see them fine, man. You're all good.
Great. So the East Mediterranean, as it suggests, rises from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, and it is the western margin of the continent of Asia. I'll be talking about the area from southern Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, all the way down to the Red Sea, and then across to the Euphrates. This has been the area that I've had most experience in and where I've travelled most extensively and researched the ecologies over recent years. My background, incidentally, was I grew up on a sheep farm in Yorkshire, and then I worked in East Africa, and then many years studying tropical ecology in South America, and then as a marine ecologist and working around Europe, and then finally in the Middle East. So I was really struck by the heterogeneity of the land when I first travelled through. I was coming from the Caucasus region, and when I came over the Taurus Mountains, you see a real profound difference in the diversity of life. The area is characterised by a sandy coastal plain, which rises up to 1,000 metres or over 3,000 feet to the mountains, which originate in the Taurus Mountains, continue down through Lebanon, peaking out at about 4,000 metres or 12,000 feet, and terminating where the Nakab Desert joins the Judean Desert, down just south of the occupied West Bank. The most striking geographic feature in the region is the Rift Valley, which is a continuation of the African Rift. The two continents are pulling apart, hinging from a spot just north of the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, and the Wad al-Araba are the dry land parts of the Rift Valley, even though some areas there are actually submarine. And then the valley plunges down into the Red Sea, and of course continues down through East Africa. There's almost a mirror image of the geography to the east of the Rift Valley, with the sheer precipices which characterize the sides of the valley, rising to the mountain tops at Qaraaqa in Jordan and up around Salt in the north of Jordan, and then going up into the Jebel Druze in Syria and joining with the anti-Lebanon mountains. The geography strongly influences the climate. So in the north of the region, it's generally wetter than the south. That's the trend. It dries out from north to south and also from west to east as you get more distant from the humid Mediterranean system. There's a rain shadow effect in the Jordan Valley, and in the Araba Valley because of the humid air which is forced up over the mountains of Judea and Jerusalem, which then, as it descends into the Jordan Valley, is warming up, so it doesn't rain. So you have some small desert areas there, for example, the Judean desert. I think the most striking thing about the climate is, although it covers quite a wide latitudinal range, the climate bands are longitudinally distributed because they follow the lines of the tectonic divisions between the ridges and the mountains. The ecology is surprisingly biodiverse. It's an expression of the heterogeneity of the land and the global position linking the continents, which facilitates terrestrial travel from north to south in the form of our own migration out of Africa, and also bird migrations, and also east to west. And a familiar example of that would be the spice roads, which pass through the north of the region, and the Silk roads, the trade routes which come through the south of the region. Up on the mountaintops, there is an Atlantic or familiar Mediterranean ecosystem, as you can see. It's dominated by a tree species called Quercus caliprinos, which is accompanied by, which is an oak species, a hard spiky-leafed oak which doesn't drop its leaves all year. And that's accompanied by wild pistachio species like Pistacia palestina, lentiscus, or Atlantica. The region's the center of global diversity for the genus Pistacia. Regionally, there are about between 8 and 10 oak species. One species dominates in any ecosystem along the mountain chains. The highest biodiversity per 0.1 hectares ever recorded is not in the world's tropical forests, but on the east slope of the River Jordan, as you come down from the areas like Jerusalem or Bethlehem towards the Dead Sea. And that's because the plants there are incredibly diverse, but also very tiny, and they also share the space through the year. So one plant may occupy it in the winter, and for example, a bulb could come and produce its leaves and flower very early, and exactly the same spot can be occupied by a herbaceous plant later in the spring, or even perhaps a couple of generations of herbaceous plants before the soil begins to dry out in April. So in addition to the tree species that so the tree species I mentioned, which characterize the Atlantic ecosystems, which fringe the Mediterranean and the mountaintops, we've got the carob tree, the Ceratonia, and also various species of Crataegus, the hawthorn. For any of you who've had the opportunity to visit the eastern seaboard of the USA, or anywhere in North Africa, or around the Mediterranean, or in Northern Europe, would find this ecosystem extremely familiar. You'd see familiar plants like daisies and brambles and dandelions. Contrary to perhaps some people's expectations, the East Mediterranean becomes extremely cold in the winter months when the majority of the precipitation falls. It mainly comes as rain, but there can be severe snowstorms as well. I've been in Amman before with at least a metre of snow standing on the ground. This is the snow that came down just in one morning in Bethlehem. That's looking to Jerusalem in the distance. And these are the terraced slopes of the monastery of Kremsan, just in the mountaintops between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. As we descend in altitude, oh, sorry, I should mention, so these are the orchards of the village of Batir, which is also in the West Bank. Now, as you come down in altitude, you enter into another large or global plant and animal community. We call that the Irano-Turanian zone, and its distribution's that's classically described by the Fertile Crescent. Here we find the ancestors of the almond, rye, wheat, pears and apples, and the landscape is these days dominated by this shrub. You can see in Arabic it's called nutch, or Sarcopterium spinosum is the Latin name. It's an extremely thorny little shrub. This ecosystem extends from the mountains of Iran, for example, Luristan, Lakistan, coming right across Anatolia, and then down, then it curves south, down the mountain chains at a middling altitude, sandwiched between the Mediterranean ecozone above it and the Indo-Asiatic steppe ecosystem, which is located directly beneath it. That's the ecosystem which provides us with gazelle and porcupine, also barley and oats. There you see species like the halicornia occurring that you don't see in the Irano-Turanian zone. As you continue to go down, and here in this photograph you can see that can be a single dramatic step. You can go from the steppe lands of Central Asia immediately down into the submarine altitudes, which are host to an African ecosystem. So there you'll see acacia trees, the zakum tree, which is Balanites aegyptica, various sorts of jujube, including the Ziziphus spinacristi, and also Moringa, the Moringa peregrina. In this area, we can also see antelope. These are actually ibex. These are the Nubian ibex of the Rift Valley. And there you also have the lowest freshwater on Earth, where there's a spring line at the foot of the Rift Valley escarpment, where ancient rainwater is coming out of the aquifer back onto the surface. So, I should say some words briefly about the changes in the political territories, because that's significant for understanding the approaches to design and the ecological techniques which we've been deploying. So, for example, if you look at the state of Palestine from 47 to the present day, you can see it's one of fragmentation and ghettoization. A lot of people have also migrated both in and out. The politics is, or the geography of the politics is further complicated by interim accords, in this case the Oslo Interim Accord, which further divides territorial areas, for example that of the Jordanian West Bank, into areas A, B, and C, so area A became under the control of the Palestinian Authority, at least in theory, and then B and C are under Israeli military rule. I included this image just so you can see how, even within the West Bank, it's not really useful to talk about, say, for example, Israeli areas or Palestinian areas or, say, Jewish areas or Arab areas, because as you can see, the blue blobs here, I know you can't read the words, nor can I, the blue blobs here represent the settlements, and the green blobs represent the pre-existing Arab communities. If you look in the area around Jerusalem, you can see how they've proliferated over all of the land, so that there's no sort of zonation which would separate them. So this is what the settlements look like. As you can see, they're very compact and homogeneous. and they have a lot of edge effect in the ecological sense of the word rather than the permaculture sense of the word. So there's very large marginal areas around the settlement into which the Arab communities don't have the right of access. I just need to, excuse me one moment, plug in a power cable. Okay, that's done. Obviously, for the economy and for traditional farming practices and lifestyles, for example, herding and agriculture, the construction of perimeter barriers like separation wall and like the fences around settlements and roads impede people's access to the land that they own, either for planting crops, maintaining them, or collecting harvests, but also for accessing resources like grazing for their animals. This area, curiously, is the effect of this wall has been to funnel the annual migration of the striped hyena from the Judean desert over towards the coastal area where they like to go for the winter. So obviously for hundreds of thousands of years they've been making this migration, but in the last decade this wall's been built. And now all the hyena get funneled into a neighbourhood of Bethlehem called Beit, much to the disgust of the people who live there. As you can see, the wall isn't a single structure, but a series of enclaves. All of these maps are very old, and all of them are inaccurate, to be honest. The situation on the ground is constantly changing. I've been trying to get you the most up-to-date maps which are available, but this is more to give you an idea for those who don't understand how how much of the Middle East is so physically structured in terms of who can go where. So if we go back to right. The course of the wall in the West Bank has been altered as it's been built in order to take advantage of the resources in the environment. So the more rain-fed areas along the mountain ridge here are included in on the Israeli side of this of these walls. As you can see, you have these great invagulations which come in to take the water resources. These little blue dots represent Palestinian artesian wells, and the purple triangles they represent the springs which I mentioned, which come out along the Rift Valley. So the pinkish area to the right, that's all under military rule with settlements, and clearly the areas to the left, which is also to the west, the people's access is excluded by the 8-meter high concentration wall and the barbed wire fences and the checkpoints. As you can see here in this town in the bottom left of the image called Qalqilia, in some cases the towns are absolutely surrounded, so you've just got, by a curtain concrete wall, so you've just got one road in and one road out, and that frustrates access to markets and directly prevents people from accessing the land that they own. So in addition to appropriating the water resources and also not permitting for the legal construction of water pipelines or the ability for communities to connect to the water infrastructure, then people turn to rainwater storage, but that's also prohibited, and the militaries in various states and territories have a policy of destroying rainwater storage cisterns. Or any structures which are built without permits or in the way. So, as you can imagine, this leads to confrontation and the appropriation of people's land and their natural resources, and often elicits a popular resistance response. But I don't really want to talk about the popular resistance directly. Instead, I'd like to draw your attention to the status of the environment and the trends which are happening there whilst all this is going on. The zonation of the land and the laws which are passed means that people can't manage the resources in the landscape adequately. We've got an accelerating rate of degradation of resources that manifests itself in having no wastewater treatment. You've got thousands of kilometres of sewage water and road runoff and industrial waste and various urban effluents pouring through the through the lower parts of the landscape all the way down to the sea. The solid waste is not recycled. There's very little sanitary landfill and no incineration, except, well, no sanitary incineration. Just as you can see, the rubbish tends to get driven out of town to the edge of the desert and dumped, and there it smoulders, and generally you have a pack of dogs living on it. I include this image because I don't mean to suggest that only Palestine is subject to these to the internal structuring of the territories. This is the most up-to-date image I could get of the situation in Syria. This is this was current today. So the grey-black area is ISIS-controlled territory. The red area is the regime in Syria, and the green area are the rebels. Just peeking in at the top there, you can see the yellow of the Peshmerga, and the purple off to the bottom right. They're the Iraqi. That's the Iraqi army, or the Iraqi state forces. So, perhaps a more realistic map of the Middle East today. Now, this is looking at a slightly broader field than where most of my research has been based. But I included it just to show that just as Palestine is typical of the region, so what's happening in the East Mediterranean is also occurring elsewhere in the world right now, especially in the Middle East, with the further disintegration of the states and ever finer political structuring within. So the reason I included this was to pose the question: how do you go about protecting the environment whilst responding with humanitarian aid and long-term support for the regeneration of the ecology in this region? The ecology has been subject to human cultural practices from as soon as we arrived in the region. So I'm not suggesting that the recent conflict has degraded the environment, but it's been thousands and thousands of years. But this is where we're at today. So the question is, what do we do about it? So one response, which I know very well, was a project based in the West Bank called the Bustan Qaraaqa project. Now, the aims of the project were to research and develop appropriate technologies and behaviours for solving the problems of accessing resources in the Middle East. Secondarily, we'd then educate, and we would share resources. So we would educate on site and through in the universities, and also share both reference materials, but also biological resources in terms of seeds and saplings, and also fish fry for fish farming projects. There's an international volunteer program, about 70 volunteers living in the Permaculture Centre throughout the year. And we'll be working with 30 plus community partners every day, both on site and in their communities. Bustan Qaraaqa Permaculture Centre was based in Beit, Sahour, just to the east of Bethlehem. It was an abandoned farm system. Everybody said it was too dry to farm. But in 6 years, we managed to turn it around and make it extremely productive. But perhaps what was the greatest yield from that system was what we learned. It was all the mistakes that we made. It was how to live in the Middle East with no particular privilege or advantage, in a way that could be sustained, and also in a way which is locally regenerative. Now, we learnt a lot through making a lot of mistakes because we were doing it all day, every day, and we had this, we had this farm in Bethlehem so that we could, precisely so we could make mistakes and so that we could implement systems, get them running nicely, and then begin to take away the resources until they failed. For example, plant some trees, and once you get them going, you can begin to stress them out in different ways to find out how to kill them. For us, that was extremely interesting information, because when we were working with our community partners, we wanted to know what's the minimum resource required to implement certain design elements. And then, so this, over time, through learning from our community partners and traveling through the region, being observant, listening, and through experimentation and collecting data and doing decent empirical research, we ended up with a lot of information that we could then disseminate through education, both on-site, both with the international volunteers, the community partners, or through more formal education events like permaculture design certificates, and I also taught in the universities. So on site we developed minimum irrigation kitchen gardens. We developed facilities built from our waste products, for example, the Beit Igzaz, or bottle house, as the name suggests, is built from glass bottles, which we were accumulating on the farm with no recycling facility nearby. The lampshades in the bottom right are lantware missile cases. And the rainwater collecting roof was made out of, or is made out of, transparent plastic drinking water bottles, so it also acts like a greenhouse roof. The Beit Igzaz was wonderful because it collected all the water that we needed for the year. It then recycled that water along a water, like a water quality gradient. We were able to reuse it within the structure, and it also ameliorated the climatic extremes. So we had a nice warm place in the winter months and a nice cool place to cook and work in the summer months. It also doubled up as like a little tropical forest, so we could recreate literally like an equatorial forest in there, with bananas and avocados and other tropical fruits, which would be killed by the frosts outside of the structure. So it was very much dictated by function. We knew what we needed from this structure, and then we used the available materials. So the form was merely an expression of that. So I've mentioned water many times. It's extremely scarce resource. The Middle East has the most water poor communities in the world. For example, in Gaza, people have on average 13 litres of water a day. The World Health Association categorises chronic water poverty as those living on less than 110 litres of water per day. But through very simple, elegant techniques, as I'm sure those listening to this will know about, so I'm not going to go into the technical detail here, or if anybody's curious you can ask me later. But rainwater harvesting is absolutely fundamental. Every civilization that ever thrived and persisted in the East Mediterranean collected and stored in a sanitary fashion rainwater. First of all, fill the plants, then fill your soil, then fill any built containers, for example, pools, reservoirs, tanks, cisterns. This is an example of a system we built on the farm out of an old latrine cave. And on the right, this is a Byzantine cistern I found whilst porcupine hunting in the Judean desert. There are a couple of examples of reservoirs which I built in the Jordan Valley. These collect the flood from a little stream, a ephemeral stream that's not normally flowing, but just put a little check dam in there just to raise the water level by a few inches, and then that's enough to fill this pool every winter to provide water for fish farming and irrigation all summer long. Agroforestry was a major technique in our kit. In these dry lands, perennial plants provide far more sustenance because they accumulate growth season on growth season, unlike the ephemerals, which of course are starting from seed each time. I think I'll go on and talk a lot more about agroforestry later, but before I say any more now, I'll take your temperature on that and see if you're interested. Essential to our agroforestry effort was the tree nursery. We grew about 90 species of tree. 40 of those were natives. Some of those were hadn't been available within the region for perhaps generations because they'd become locally expatriated. So I travelled around the whole region and I collected all of the seeds from everywhere from Iran to Armenia, Georgia, across Turkey, down through Syria, Iraq, and Palestine and Egypt, Jordan, and collected all of the native seeds together. And then we would propagate those in the nursery, and then we planted literally hundreds of forests with different suites of species at different altitudes in different situations all over the landscape in Palestine, and now this year we're getting thousands of trees planted in Jordan. So we'll see who does best where. But the important thing is to get them in the ground so that they are producing seeds in situ. That way, everyone isn't always dependent upon one supplier. What I mean is, it's their future is more secure the more widely spread they are. Because the landscape's been mainly denuded since the Bronze Age, fuel has always been in short supply. So solar cooking technology, which is a relatively recent introduction to the East Mediterranean, so far as I can judge by people's reactions, is extremely popular. I mean, people are skeptical at first, but as any of you who live at these latitudes know, the sun can be extremely powerful, and so cooking is it's a no-brainer. Already people commonly heat their water with the sun, so I think it's just one step to give that a little push further to make solar cooking the norm in domestic situations throughout the East Mediterranean. The oven on the left is designed for someone who lives in a village or a town or a city. As you can see, in this case, you can stand it on the terrace or put it on your roof, but the door is in the back, so it kind of opens like an oven door. So you could build it into the side of a house, you know, on the southern aspect of a house. So it could be like through your kitchen wall, for instance, and that way, you know, it would be just like using a normal oven. You wouldn't have to carry your pots and pans outside. The photo on the right is a very simple design, as you can see, made with cardboard and tin foil and a soot blackened teapot. In this case, we're putting it in a plastic bag, but it's not actually necessary. You can make tea without it. So that's because not everybody is sedentary. A large proportion of families in the East Mediterranean area are pastoralists, and they'll move around, and they also have to cover large areas with their flocks in order to find them adequate forage. So this is my friend Ode from the Jahilin, and I once went out with him and he was breaking open rocks in the desert with a pickaxe to look for the roots of the ratam, which is a sort of desert broom. Now, the ratam had disappeared long since. Like you can't actually find the shrubs anymore, but the roots are still there in the rocks. So this is how fuel poor the community is, and many of my friends burn rubbish through the winter, both for heating the house and for cooking, and just to stay warm, because they don't have access to other types of fuel. They can't afford to go out and buy a bottle of gas, for instance. So sometimes different designs are required to be appropriate for different lifestyles, and this is an example of that. Rocket stoves also help us to use the fuel available more conservatively. We found these extremely popular. A lot of my friends now drive around with one of these rocket stoves on the right in their boot, so when they're out when they're out on the road or in the desert, then they can just stop and make a cup of tea whenever they want. And the photo on the left is an oven, actually made out of a gas bottle for the chamber of the oven, but it's working on rocket stove principles, and yeah, you can cook pizzas in there, bread or roasted chicken, whatever you want. Aquaculture and aquaponics are extremely useful technologies in this context, because water's in short supply, and you have to store the winter rain so that you'll have access to water through the long summer months. So if you've created a water storage, why not get an additional purpose out of it, an additional crop from it by farming fish in there? They'll also maintain an ecosystem in there. So you might be wondering why create an open pool in an area of high evaporation. And the only reason you would do that, because normally you would, when you're storing water, you would do that in a closed system to prevent the evaporation. But in this case, we actually want the input of the solar energy, because that's what's driving the ecosystem. So the algae in the water and the simple plants provide the foodstuff for the fish, and also for crustaceans and other invertebrates, who in turn can become food for the fish. And aquaponics. Oh, so just step back one moment to aquaculture. A great reason to produce fish is that there's a demand for animal protein. The farming of sheep and goats is a major agent in the denudation of all of the vegetable material from the land, and also because fish aren't fighting gravity, they grow very fast. So it's a very it's a quick and easy way to provide protein for your family or for the market. And a simple extension of that then is to include vegetable production with your fish farming. So as you know, aquaponics is a combination of the hydroponic technology of growing crops without soil, combined with fish farming in containers. So the fish need clean water, and the plants need fertilizer, so they complement one another when the plants take the fish excreta out of the water, and that's their fertilizer. The aquaponics is especially applicable to areas of very high population density, where people have no access to any sort of soil or land. For example, in a refugee camp, some of these refugee camps are now nearly 80 years old. People are fourth generation. They're far more populous than they were at their creation. They're very crowded. Lots of people live in a single building. So if you can, in a very small footprint, be producing both fish and maybe some salad and fruit crops to supplement your kitchen, then that's quite practical for a rooftop or a small courtyard environment. It's probably not it's probably not an appropriate way to produce food on a large scale in a field situation. We also took advantage of volunteers who wanted to come and live in the West Bank and get involved with the project in a big way. They made the project happen. Couldn't possibly have done it without them and the community partners. We also had some long-term internships from various universities, and many people made a huge contribution over the years. Our community partners came to us. We didn't go looking for them. They came from various communities, from the cities or the farmers, or perhaps they were had come from a city, or their parents or grandparents were from a city, but they'd actually grown up in a refugee camp. You have both city and farming people, and even Bedouins in refugee camps. But we also worked with the tribes who still live away from the towns and villages. This is an example of a workshop I was doing in a community in the North Jordan Valley as part of adaptation to living in an ever hotter climate with an ever diminishing water supply. We're implementing grey water systems and rooftop rainwater collection, and then following that up with incredibly productive, highly diverse food forests in each of the households. This community are farmers who live in caves. They would live in houses, but they're not permitted to build a house. It's knocked down when they try. So they live in ancient caves instead, and they produce butter. That's what they do for a living. They have a small herd, and they produce butter. They'd already started to plant some vines and some fruit trees into the valley, and when I saw that, I really wanted to help them. So we brought them lots of trees from the Bustan Qaraaqa nursery, and we worked with them to establish this little desert orchard in what's otherwise the utterest desert. So this community are the real extreme of water poverty. They have to drag their water for 2 hours by tractor and trailer over very difficult broken roads. They fill up their trailer from an Israeli settlement, and then they drive that out to where they live, because they're not allowed to lay a pipe or a hose pipe, and also they're not permitted to collect and store rainwater. And finally, I just wanted to put this tree species in because it's one of the most useful species that we use. It's called Moringa peregrina. I'm sure you're aware of the Moringa oleifera and its extremely high nutritional value. Well, this is the species which grows along the shores of the Red Sea and up the Rift Valley all the way to Syria, but only in the hottest, driest parts, and only in the sort of rocky valley sides. It's almost extinct now, or it had pretty much vanished from the West Bank. We planted thousands of them over recent years, so hopefully it'll be making a comeback. One of the reasons it's so useful, beyond its delicious, nutritious seeds, I noticed that a lot of people are eating the leaf, but I do recommend that you eat moringa seed. You can cook those like chickpeas. It's definitely more of a meal. If you take the outside of the seed pod and grind that up into a powder, you can then add that to rainwater storage systems, and it will flocculate the clay out of the water, which then denies a growth substrate for the pathogenic organisms that could otherwise be causing diarrhea and other diseases, posing a health hazard to the entire community. It's a chronic problem in communities who collect and store rainwater through necessity. So that is the end of my little presentation. I do have some other materials which I would like to present, but I thought perhaps at this stage, if I could invite Raleigh back in if he's not fallen asleep.
Hey.
Oh. And perhaps we could make it a bit more of a conversation now, and have some questions. Find out what people are interested in, and see if you want to go into a little bit more detail about specific techniques.
Yeah, sure, man. Thomas, that was great. Thank you for presenting that. Like, it's really cool seeing rocket stoves, and I didn't really know kind of that situation that they were dealing with, like not being able to collect rainwater, and oof, that's tough, man. I'm sure you've seen a lot, and in our conversations, you've gone through a lot of shit, man, over there. But yeah, so I'm opening this up to questions. Also, welcome, Neil. Now we have 3 guys with messy hair. Fantastic.
That's right. Sorry I was late, everybody. I got stuck at customs in the Jeddah airport. I was in Beirut earlier today and then flew into Jeddah tonight. And the Jeddah airport might be the worst on the planet. It's just so unorganized, and there's no system, and Anyhow, so glad to be here. I did catch most of what you're doing, Tom. The only thing I want to say is we have also come to highly value Moringa peregrina. We've planted 800 of them on our site, and we have a plan. If we get access to the land, we plan to plant about another 100,000 of them.
Excellent.
In a wadi.
I hope I can be part of the germplasm collecting mission then. Make sure you get some good genetic stock.
Yeah, so all of our seeds come from Medina. I don't know. I'd love to get some from Yemen, but Yemen's a little too hairy right now.
Yeah.
To do any sort of germplasm collection.
Yeah, but the species extends right up to Syria, so it's quite a
right.
A range.
The crazy thing is nobody in my region, in the Mecca region, knows what it is.
No, what do they call it?
They don't call it anything. Like, it grows north of us and it grows south of us, but it doesn't grow where we are.
Yeah.
And so when I start, like, the Bedou don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it must have grown here before because it's native to the Sinai and it's native to Yemen, and it doesn't make sense to me that it wouldn't have been here right in the middle of that. But I would imagine that it was eradicated through overuse. Because it is so useful. I understand that it's dying out in the Sinai as well because the Bedou are overusing it.
Well, it's also a very fragile tree. Like, if you once it's mature, if you get a windstorm, it will literally smash it to pieces.
Yeah.
So they're kind of fragile.
So we've got ours interplanted with mesquite.
Mm.
And they seem to be doing really well. We planted ours from seed, and we got 90% germination rate.
Yes.
And we didn't inoculate. We haven't done compost. We haven't done mulch, and they're easily growing better than anything else we've got, except for maybe some of the ziziphus.
Yeah. They're similar like that. They both tend to sulk after transplanting, and then the Moringa is going to be, at least in my experience, it stays sebaceous for 3 to 4 years, like completely dying back to soil level. So don't despair if in the 3rd year you've got a nice tree with a beautiful trunk and even that dies.
That would surprise me, actually, because we're in the 2nd year with these, and some of them fruited, and they haven't died down.
Right. I think you get air frosts ever.
No, there's no frost here ever. And we haven't irrigated for 7 months.
No, I don't think it will help it to irrigate.
Yeah.
Are you growing them in the rocks? I don't know what your site's like. I haven't had opportunity to see it. Is it a rocky site or a sandy site, or?
We have Rocky Mountains as half the site, and sandy, gravelly floodplain as half the site. You should check my stuff on my Facebook page. That's what you should do, because I've got pictures on there. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I'm very happy that you and I both came to the same conclusion after years of being in the same kind of area, that Moringa peregrina is, the zenith of agroforestry in the Middle East.
It's a great species. What I like most about it is its summer deciduous character, so you can maintain a positive water budget.
Exactly. All right. Let's. We've got a couple questions. Raleigh, you want to go through those, or should we? Let's get the questions we've got, and then see where we go from there.
Yeah, cool. I'll need to go in maybe like 20 minutes from now, but I'm sure you can take it from there if people want to hang around.
That's cool.
All right, so first question's from Julie. She says, not being allowed to collect rainwater must certainly be a human rights abuse. Yeah.
Is it human rights abuse in Colorado? Because it's illegal in Colorado, too.
Yeah,
and I've heard it is in Arizona as well. But
I think there are a number of southwestern states.
Yeah, that seems to be the trend internationally, is that those who haven't legislated are now legislating or preparing to legislate to make rainwater harvesting the sole right of the state, not the individual.
Bullshit. That's why it's good to have good PR on your side, so if they ever try to do that.
So the reason we do it is because the control of access to natural resources is it's the main device used to dispossess people, to appropriate their land and to take their resources. So without any military confrontation and without a shot fired, you can clear a family off their land, or even move a whole town out of a valley simply by cutting the water supply off in a landscape which doesn't have natural water storages in it, and where you don't have streams and springs. So rainwater harvesting in situ is a great way of decentralizing the way that a community accesses a natural resource. And in that way, it's strategically important for giving them that community resilience to survive the shock of a military attack, or through the infrastructure being closed off. I mean, it's also necessary, of course, that not only does the oppressor have to monopolize the infrastructure, but they also have to make it illegal for you to build any other form of connecting infrastructure. And once you're 100% dependent upon their water supply, that's when they cut it off. So that's why they don't want you to have a backup.
That's tough, man. Okay, Lee Cockles says, one of your pictures seemed to show an apricot tree at about 35 minutes. Is that correct? And is there enough water for them, or did it require special conservation?
No, that's what we call the Mishmish melody. So that's the local, say the vernacular apricot for Bethlehem. If you're thinking of planting apricots, I can't recommend it strongly enough. It has very large, almost white fruits, slight slight lemon color, flushed with pink on the sunny side, and they have the most gorgeous fragrant flavor. They're not too sweet, and the texture is just perfect, much nicer than the orange apricot, which is more commonly found in markets. The apricot's thought to have been developed in Armenia. Of course, the almond probably comes from Armenia or Azerbaijan. If you look at the distribution of wild species, then it would appear that's the centre of biodiversity for the whole genus of Prunus or Amigynus or whatever you want to call it. So the apricots, the only consideration there is that they're very deep-rooted. So plant them in a clay soil if you've got one, and find them a place on your site with the deepest soil. And remember, they're not long-lived trees. I was recently asked to consult, I shan't say who, but the problem was that they had some stone fruits that were all dying, and they tried everything, and they thought they had some unknown disease. And it turned out they were all between like 60 and 90 years ago that they planted them. So they'd literally just reached the end of their lives. They're not olive trees. They're not going to live for thousands of years. So yeah, with stone fruit, give them a deep clay soil. Never irrigate them ever, because they really don't need it. And don't be surprised if it's replace it after 30 years if you want to keep a good amount of fruit coming in.
So there's two questions that are very related. It's from Julie and Cornell. Julie says, let's talk about food forest, and Cornell says, what's the best way to get trees growing in a desert? Right, so
this second little presentation I was going to, although as I've explained, I'm actually on the road at the moment, so I don't have any resources with me, but I have a draft of a book which I had with me, and we also have I could show you some bits of it. So there's chapters on food forests, specific food forests for different climate areas within East Mediterranean. I go into a great deal of detail, and I'd be happy to talk through that now, or perhaps if you just want to read that and then contact me afterwards, and I could answer any further questions you have about it. So it was food forests, and the second question was foresting the desert, was it?
Yeah, how do you get trees growing, best in a desert?
Right. So, well, I'll just say a few words about food forests. I'm sure you're all aware what they are and what the idea is. When you're working in West Asia, I think your biggest consideration will be with light, because the last thing you want to do is create a sort of dark, dusty forest. So I start out planting at about a 9-to-1 ratio. So for each tree that I want to be there in my food forest, say after 25 years, I'm going to plant 9 trees as a chaperone to get that tree through there. And I'm going to kill them off gradually over the years. So I think, yeah, with food forests, the key is diversity, and then diversity in time as well. Like you need to you need to have a very hands-on approach to manage the demography of the food forest as it matures. And if you're not sure about if you're planting a tree in the right place or not, I would say just plant it, and if you find it's the wrong place, kill it. Simple as that. Don't worry about putting stuff in the wrong place. As for the deserts, there are a whole range of specific techniques. Wherever possible, work from seed. Like the younger that you can get the trees out there, the better that they're going to adapt to their circumstances. They'll get inoculated with the right symbionts early on, and if they're going to survive, then they will. And from your perspective, it's requires far fewer resources to establish a tree through direct sowing than through propagation in a nursery and then transplantation. I think I usually use the metaphor of a person. If you imagine if a baby goes to live in another culture, they grow up there, they speak the language without an accent, they enjoy the food, they get on with life without any frustrations or difficulties. Whereas as an adolescent or as a young adult, if you go to live in another culture, then you've got to learn the language, and you're always struggling to fit in 100%. And I think that's also true of trees. So get them into their final situation as young as possible. Of course, if you've only got a handful of a seed, which is going to be very difficult to source again, then you're going to want to take better care of it, and then you probably want to grow it on in the nursery first. Also for deforestation, like the thing I really want to say is please don't put up fences. That seems to be a knee-jerk reaction. I think that's a form of colonialism. We come from a world of fences and perimeters on properties, but that's not part of the cultural expression, at least not traditionally in the Middle East. So Instead, plant them, create hedgerows and create excluding perimeters to keep grazers out. But more useful than any hedge or any fence will be a good relationship with your local shepherds. So make sure that they're benefiting. Make sure that they get a resource out of that system right from the outset, because it's in those first 3 years that they can do you most damage if a shepherd decides to turn a blind eye to his flock, or if he decide for whatever reason your perimeter's compromised. So I would put the emphasis right from the outset on keeping a good relationship with the other people using the land, invite them in, make sure there's something there for them, make sure that it's as much in their interests to maintain it and protect it as it is yours. For most, like the single biggest part of the budget for any sort of desert afforestation projects I've worked on has been for fences, and I just think that's terrible. I mean, what a terrible way to start the project, by buying iron. It's, so maybe think about your perimeter right from the outset. Plant species like Agave americana, or there's the trying to remember its name. Just one moment.
Something spiky.
What's it called? Duvalis. What's the species name of Duvalis? The really spiny one.
I'm thinking Ocotillo. That's what I'm thinking of.
Oh no, I don't really see that. Anyway, there are lots and lots of really spiny hedging species that you can use. They form very, very dense thickets. You can use Ziziphus. You can use the prickly pear cactus. You can use agave, sisal, depending on if you're in more tropical areas. They're not going to need any irrigation. They're tough as old boots, and they form a totally impenetrable barrier. If you do use a fence, then I suggest you consider recycling it. So you use that maybe to establish some trees so they can get high enough to escape the herbivores, and then take that fence and move it to a new area and then plant within it again. So like, step by step, you're establishing a forest. But I think if you're doing it in that way, then you've got bigger problems, to be honest, and it's probably not going to succeed. If you're having to defend yourself on that level, then I think your issues there are probably culturally how you're going about the project, rather than any sort of ecological or climatological limitation. We could say a lot about foresting in deserts. I could blither on forever, so you have to keep interject, guys. So pit planting is a technique I like. Dig down a meter. Obviously, you've got to pay attention to the subsoil conditions. There's no point taking a nursery-grown tree and some nice substrate and then dropping it into a pit of calcium carbonate or marl or something. Unless it's a carob or a Ziziphus or a Moringa. But something even like an acacia, that's not going to, or even a Ziziphus, that's not going to fight its way out of a pit of calcium carbonate or compacted marl. So, but nevertheless, pit planting is really useful. So if you're working with trees that are less than 30 centimeters, less than a foot tall, if you dig a pit which is about a cubic meter, and then you excavate your planting hole at the bottom of that, put in as much topsoil as you can, really get down there. I always find the limitation is actually between it's on the shaft of the pickaxe. So when you're working, you get to a point where the shaft hits the rim of the hole, preventing you from actually scooping any deeper. But at that point, it's deep enough. So a 30 centimeter tree then can keep its head out of the sun for almost all of the day, and the roots will be out of the sun for all but a couple of hours in the middle of the day. And from the from the point of experience of that little tree, that's a radically different microclimate to be establishing in for the first 2, 3, 4 years than if you were to plant it without sinking it down into a pit, if you were just to plant it at ground level. Also, as organic material blows around in the wind, that will collect in the pit. And when it does rain, you should get a little bit of extra runoff accumulating around its roots. So it's especially practical for establishing trees in areas that you're not going to have much opportunity. You're not going to be able to micromanage it. You're not going to be able to go back and be checking on these trees many times through the season. And one final point is it also helps to some extent with herbivory, because there are few herbivores who are happy shoving their head down into a pit where they can't see something sneaking up behind them. So they might trim stuff off at the top, but they're not at least going to destroy the young tree. So it's worth going to the effort of pit planting in desert conditions. But yeah, lay it out sequentially. So you want a good relationship. You want to understand everyone who's using the land in all seasons and make sure that you're not frustrating them. If you need them to change the way they're doing things, then you've got to work with them so they can still get what they wanted. Then, if necessary, plant your grazer perimeter. Get windbreaks and fire breaks in as well, especially if you're working with a good thick mulch. Now, if you can get hold of that, of course, that's always ideal. You can bring a lot of material from elsewhere, perhaps if you're working in a desert environment. You can be collecting it for literally a year or two. It takes a long time to collect mulch beforehand, or if you've got connections perhaps with some other aspect of the industry, for example, like date palm industry, you can often get truckloads of palm leaves. Dry those out there, get the soil covered. Obviously, you know all the great reasons why you want to mulch the soil. I'm not going to go into that. The point I wanted to make was make sure it doesn't catch fire, because once you put all that stuff there, you've got that desert wind blowing over it, then it's like a tinderbox, and you can see all your work just go up in 5 minutes when someone flicks their fag ash on it. So you want to incorporate plenty of fire breaks. I wouldn't just go with a perimeter fire break, but I'd also have some internal fire breaks, because let's face it, the fire's about as likely to start from the inside as it is from the outside, in my experience anyway. Otherwise, I think it's species selection in this draft book, which I'm going to post the link to. It's always up online for anyone to access and download anyway. I've got sections on food forests for the Middle East, and also a whole chapter on afforesting the desert, both desert food forests and also the other types of desert ecosystems. For example, those established on salt springs. I don't know what it's like in the region that you're working in, Neil, but we find that all along the Judean Valley and around settlements where wastewater is being discharged into the environment and simply evaporates, we have a lot of salt accumulation in the soil. Some of it's coming from old salt beds in the geology, so there are some springs that come out of the ground incredibly salty. And in other places, it's the product of inappropriate irrigation and unmanaged wastewater discharge. So they, we have ecological solutions. They're all extremely simple, and we just need to get on and implement them. So we can turn that around very quickly. There's a whole suite of species that will sequester that salt. They'll recover the ecosystem, and at the same time, they'll be giving you valuable products every day as they're doing that. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail all about it. So there are designs there that shows you like which trees, how to position them relatively, which one to put next to the other. There are species lists, and there are also discussions of techniques. It's all pretty simple and straightforward. I've not tried to make it elaborate. As you can probably see, my approach is much optimization as making the most of few resources. Sorry, Riley, what were you saying?
Put up like the cover of that book to like the webcam so people can see it, and we can send it out in the email.
Agroforestry for Palestine.
Agroforestry for Palestine.
Yeah, email that to us, and we'll include it with the replay that everyone's going to get, by the way. So, right.
It's on the Bustan Qaraaqa webpage.
Sorry?
It's on the Bustan Qaraaqa webpage.
It is. If it's there, I
downloaded it like 5 years ago.
Touch any buttons in case I disrupt something, but I could just send you the link right now. No, I'll do it as soon as we're done, and then you'll distribute it. Yeah. So it's a good resource. The thing is, I used to explain this stuff literally every day, and finally someone said, "Why don't you write it down so people don't have to ask you in person?" So that was a good idea. It saved me a lot of breath.
I've got a follow-up question for you on the salt sequestration.
Yeah.
Do you have research on that? Or have you any direct observations about salt content decreasing as a result of mycorrhizal activity or anything along those lines? Because I've heard that this is the case. We certainly have some very basic soil or salinized soil when it comes to our pH. And I'm wondering if you've got any research on that.
No, so it came about. So obviously I've been dealing with wastewater streams, black water and grey water, and working in degraded soils. But it really came to a head when I was asked to design for a Bedouin community in the Jordan Valley who have a red-hot salt spring, coming out the ground, the hottest place on earth during the summer. We're almost half a kilometre, a third of a mile under sea level, surrounded by the rock precipices of the Jordan Valley. So it's a real oven-like environment.
It's a giant stone oven.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you add the military occupation and all of the obstruction that goes with that, and it's a tough environment to work in. Incidentally, there's a 10,000-year-old city right there, also next to this spring. So over thousands of years, they raised a mound 30 meters over the plain. So it's always been a favourable place to live. It's not really a problem, but the problem was the community there were trying to grow. They were trying to grow barley, and they were trying to grow fava beans, broad beans as we call them in British English, and tomatoes. They would try in the summer, and the plants would grow fine for a few weeks, and then they just keel over and die, and then there would be a salt crust on the surface of the fields like it had snowed. So the problem there was the water they were using to irrigate from the spring was evaporating and leaving the solute in the surface soil. This area gets about 55 millimeters of rainfall on average a year, and the summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees C in the shade every day throughout summer, and there is no shade. So it's as hot as anywhere it gets, really. So there I put together about 30 species using as many I don't really like the term native species, but you know what I mean, these spontaneously occurring local species. And but I also chucked in some species from South America, from North America, from Africa, and from Australia, just to get a functioning ecology, because I thought if we could just get the rate of bioaccumulation happening fast enough, then the salt sequestration rate would exceed the rate at which the salt was arriving in the soil. And it worked. It was great. We also built a little, so the hot water came out, and then that went into a fish farming pool for farming saltwater fish, in a landlocked territory, far from the sea. And of course, because it's warm water, brilliant for fish farming. They grow incredibly fast. And the inverts just chuck themselves in, especially on a full moon, or you just chuck a little bit of animal manure in there, and all the water goes green, and they filter the algae out. You don't need to buy fancy fish food or anything to get a good fish harvest. And then that water just went with gravity, and it seeped out with a subterranean irrigation system under a thick mulch. And yeah, it thrived. The trees shot up. We actually planted them in August, which was crazy, but even then. Since the area was invaded by the military, and that family were evicted, but that's the nature of these regions.
That's cool. All right. I'm going to go in. Neil, you know how to close it off to stop the recording? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Absolutely.
Thomas, thank you so much. That was a fantastic, eye-opening presentation. And I'm
Are you
going
going
to
to be the main presenter?
What's that? You are going to be the main presenter, so I'm going to
Cool.
share Neil's screen. And also, besides, I'll send the replay of the webinar to everybody, and we've got a really cool webinar with Sergey Zimov with Nikita Zimov of Pleistocene Park on Saturday. So that'll be exciting.
That's right.
All right, your screen all shared.
Yeah, we're good.
All right, thanks everybody. Take care.
Yeah, we're good. Well, let's see. Let's see if any of you folks have any more follow-up questions. Julie Johnston asked Tom, what would be an example of something you'd plant that a shepherd would benefit from? I think this was when you were talking about planting hedges to kind of help manage animal access.
So I'm going to take the question literally, and I think we always want direct benefits rather than indirect benefits. So that shepherd's going to be probably selling, in this region at least, he's probably going to be making butter, or he's going to be making a sort of petrified yogurt to sell at the market in order to go and buy food. So as much as he can produce at home to substitute what he would buy in the market is going to be a direct help. That's money in the wallet, isn't it?
Yeah.
But in terms of what would I plant for perhaps the question, or another way to interpret the question would be, what designs or what species would we plant to benefit the inclusion of livestock in a system? Well, so when thinking about livestock, I know we've got a lot of shepherds in the region, and that's how I grew up as well, and I hope to do some more shepherding, but there's too many goats and sheep in the world. There really are. And there are far more efficient ways of producing protein. So first of all, I would wonder, if you want animal protein in your diet, does it really have to be from sheep or goats? Possibly fish, because they're not fighting gravity. They're going to be a lot more productive. You're going to have a lot more to eat. Think of it that way. Then what about those species that go and collect resources and bring them back to you instead of you having to provide resources to your livestock? So there you've got bees, of course, and you've got pigeons, much underrated and delicious. But if we are then designing for sheep and goats, in the Middle East there seem to be two modes. If you're a settled person, if you're living in a town or a city, you keep a sheep in the garage. You go out and you cut the greens on the verges, you cut trees, you give them household waste, and if you need to, then you also buy perhaps some barley and some chopped straw to get them through the summer. Otherwise, you'll probably have a herd of goats or a flock of sheep or a mixed flock, and in that situation you'll have to keep moving through the landscape, because you're not going to find one area that can sustain that herd all year. You need a very big farm for a flock or a herd of several hundred animals, beneath which it's really not even economical for a small family to make and sell dairy produce. You'd need at least that many creatures to make it worthwhile. So they're what they tend to do is they split the herds up. Typically, the herds belong to the women, so they'll take their animals and they'll perhaps take a son of school age, and they'll go off and sit in a tent in a nice green part of the landscape until the stock have eaten it all and they've moved on. So dealing with, as I was presenting to you, the landscapes are becoming more structured, the freedom of movement is ever diminishing, and there's a great deal of pressure also within the culture to move away from that lifestyle and to settle in a permanent home. I should point out many of these herders, of course, do have permanent homes. They'll have a big family home somewhere, but they can't keep all the stock there all year, so the whole family splits up and they go to collect resources over the greater landscape. So again, I think in order to supply them with food, because at least in the West Bank, only 10% of what the animals eat grows on the land. 90% is barley, which is imported mainly from Canada and from the Ukraine. And so they're making butter to buy diesel, to bring water, and to bring barley to make butter. That's their trap. They're out in the desert because they need the space, not because it's providing them with much by way of resource. So when I'm working with these herding communities, I'm first and foremost trying to provide for the people. I'm trying to create little gardens that are going to feed them directly. And then secondarily, I'm trying to reduce their greatest expense, which is diesel. As I've mentioned, they've got to go get the barley, but far heavier is the water. So they can drive for, say, 2 hours to fill up a water tanker to drag it back to where their stock are to water the stock. Now, if you keep stock under trees instead of in the traditional goat hair tent, the Beit, then they consume just a third of the water, typically. You've also then got a bit of firewood, and those trees could also be providing you with something to eat. So that would be my, without knowing the exact situation. I mean, that's commonly the first thing I've done. Then is to establish some trees which are going to provide something to the family around where they're watering their stock, so you can keep their stock in the shade of the trees when they're not grazing. The next thing then to think about would be very rapid species which rapidly accumulate a biomass, and a nutritious one at that. So if you want your animals to grow fat and produce lots of milk, then you're going to have to provide them with protein. So you want to include leguminous species in their diet. Most of the legumes in the ecosystems of the East Mediterranean are not hard woody species. They are very small shrubby woody species. They're mainly in the genus Caesalpileaceae, but also some brooms and, so the family Caesalpileaceae, things like the astragalus. These little pea-flowered shrubs, some of them are sticky to the touch, and they often have flowers ranging from sort of pink, yellow, white. So these are not really going to feed your stock, are they? So in this case, I think I might look to some other floras. I think that, for example, it depends where you are and what the laws are as to what you can use. But for example, in the East Med, we can use Lucina leucocephala, which is surprisingly drought tolerant. So I grow it successfully on just 400 millimeters of rainfall a year, and that's an average. So that's dropping down to less than 50 some years, and it'll hang on in there. Now, in Mexico, where it's native, it can grow 10 meters a year. It's an incredible rate of bioaccumulation. It's unmatched by any other tree that I'm aware of. But in these in a drier ecosystem, it's going to be much less productive, but it's more productive than anything else I've seen. Just be careful with legumes because they're also toxic. it's the same chemical structure in snake venom as it is in many legumes, seeds, things like lentils and peas and so on. So you can poison the animals by giving them too much. In the case of Lucina leucocephala, it mustn't exceed more than 18% of the dry mass of the animal's diet. But that's still a significant proportion, and it's a really great food supplement. Otherwise, you can look at other useful plants. For example, the Calotropis procera, or the Sodom apple, is a very useful species for treating fungal diseases of the skin and fungal diseases of hoof rot and the like. There are many remedies I know of. Some of them I'm not sure whether the herbal component's entirely useful. I was learning about one recently where they're rubbing burnt asphodels onto the udders for mastitis, but when they actually trialed it, they found that hand cream had a similar effect, and it was probably the massaging of the udder that was doing the good rather than the herbal remedy. But it's always worth trying. So hopefully that gives some answers to the question.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on you. The Lucina I've trialed failed entirely where I am. We are averaging 55 millis a year on my site.
Averaging. Yeah,
I wouldn't. 560.
Yeah, that's definitely outside your range, isn't it? Because in the mountains in the East Med, we're getting 2,000 millimeters. So.
Oh heavens.
That's the range I'm looking at. I'm looking at 2,000 down to,
That's not a desert.
Yeah, that's like Berlin or Paris.
Yeah.
The highlands of Jordan and Palestine get a higher total precipitation than London or Paris or Berlin. The problem is it all comes during 4 to 5 months of the year, and then you've got to
and it runs off
in the soil, in the plants, and in any rainwater harvesting capacities you have.
Wow. Jennifer Brownson, that plant that is vigorous, it's called Lucina, Leucaena.
That's a terrible
spelling. Tom and I pronounce it very differently, actually, but it's Lucina leucocephala if you have an American accent, and however Tom says it if you're British.
To be honest, I tend to pronounce Latin with a Spanish accent because they sound out every vowel, and that way I remember how to spell it.
Yeah.
I was taught how to pronounce Latin in school, but I don't use that accent for this. Lucina leucocephala, Leucaena. There are perhaps 100 species. I've trialed 3 of them in the East Med, and all but 2 were useless because they're neither frost hardy nor drought tolerant, and wherever you are in the East Med, you've got to have one of those 2 characters or both.
Yeah. Anyhow, we've been going on for about an hour and a half now, and that's typically when we cut off the recording. But I do want to say, Tom, that I've been trying to track you down for like 3 years. Ever since I downloaded that, because when I was initially researching species for my site, I came across your stuff, and I was like, some of this is probably going to work, and some of it won't, because you do get so much more water than I do. And since then, like you were kind of all over the place, but I knew we wanted you on here, and so I'm so happy that we could find you and get you to come on. I really am having fun. And you've got a couple feedback on here from people who are saying thank you so much for this. I'm going to turn off the recording. And then we are off the record at that point, and we can keep going if we want. But this is where we're going to cut it off officially. All right. So thanks everybody for coming. Sign up on sustainabledesignmasterclass.com for our email list if you're not on there already, and we'll talk to you later.